Good evening. My name is Joanne Toms, and I'm with the City of Glendale Water Services Department. Also joining me tonight is Ann Staley with the Water Services Department and Madeline with the Watershed Management Group. Thank you for being here. This is our fourth virtual class this fall. And if this is your first time on Zoom, congratulations, good job. It took me a while to learn it, and so I'm really glad that you're taking advantage of that technology. So just really happy to have everybody here tonight. We've got good attendance. I'm seeing about 30 people, so that's awesome on a Wednesday evening. All right, so I'm going to go over some logistics. Okay, attendees, you will all be muted, okay? And the session will be recorded. So if you didn't catch everything, don't worry, because there will be a video of this afterwards. You can type your questions and comments in the Q&A or the chat function, and we will go ahead and read and respond to them throughout the webinar. So, you know, the questions, the chat, it's not going to interrupt the presenter because they won't be monitoring that. It'll be Ann and I. So keep the questions coming, and we'll do what we can to answer. We'll be here for about an hour and a half this evening. If you experience any technical difficulties, please contact Ann Staley, and I'm going to give you her email. It is astahley@glendaleaz.com, or you can also call her at 623-930-3550. So give a call, give an email if you're having any issues. We want you to get a lot out of this. And then a follow-up email with the PowerPoint, the resources, recording, and a link to a class survey. We really want feedback from people, what you liked about the classes, what other topics you're interested in. Did this time work out? Is the day okay? And one lucky person who fills out the survey will get a free Corona hand pruner. And those hand pruners are really nice. I have, I think, 2 pairs at home that I use for trimming my trees and my shrubs, and I love it. So you want to get a nice bypass hand pruner. Stay away from those anvil hand pruners. They're just going to squish your plants. All right, so again, I just want to go over some of the Zoom attendee features. On the bottom of your screen, you are going to see chat and Q&A. We just disabled the raise hand because there's just too many options sometimes with Zoom. So you can contact us either chat or the Q&A. You can make the image larger. So if you have a hard time seeing the PowerPoint, know that you can make that bigger or smaller, and the presenter view bigger and smaller. So kind of play with that. And then if you're having a hard time hearing, check your computer's audio settings. And that's usually going to be on the left-hand side of your computer. Okay. So I really want to thank Watershed Management Group. They have helped make this fall class series possible. It is sponsored by the City of Glendale Water Services Department, but we're so grateful to have WMG give us so much great information and do this virtually. This is the first time this fall that we're doing these classes virtually. This is the 4th class, but we've never done virtual programming before. So I'm excited to introduce you to Madeline. Madeline has worked with Watershed Management Group, also known as WMG, for 2 years, but she volunteered with them for years before that. She manages the Green Living Co-op program, focused on teaching the community how to install and design their own rainwater and gray water harvesting systems. She is a Sonoran Desert native and proud water conservation specialist. So Madeline, thank you. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to hand over the controls to you.
Okie dokie. Let's see. I always forget that you have to have your PowerPoint open in order to share it. So give me 1 second here.
You bet. And I want to give Ann a shout out. Ann took this awesome picture that is behind me. And this was taken at the Glendale Xeriscape Demonstration Garden. And so it looks like I'm in a Sonoran Desert forest. So I love this picture. So thanks for creating this, Ann.
Yeah, I was going to ask you to, like, how you work that out, because I want to have a beautiful rain garden behind me next time. Okay, welcome everyone, and thanks for that great introduction, Joanne. I'm Madeline, worked with Watershed Management Group for 2 years. It's a great organization here in Tucson, Arizona, really focused on engaging with and empowering the community to make their neighborhoods and make their cities more sustainable, more friendly to just being outside and enjoying being outside together. And one of the great ways that we do that is classes like this. Usually they're in person, but I really appreciate that Glendale's given us the opportunity to reach a broader audience. So let's go from there. And this is a bit of a different start. I hope you'll enjoy it with me, but I just wanted to tell you about a few trees before we get into the specifics of tree care. And this first one is my favorite example, not just because I sound like a tree snob when I talk about it, but just because it's pretty awe-inspiring to me. So the photo that you're looking at right now is a tree that actually has a name. It's called Methuselah, which is based on some Greek or Roman really cool person, I'm sure. But it is a Great Basin bristlecone pine, and it is in the White Mountains of California. It's actually in a grove of bristlecone pine that are of similar ages, but this is the oldest known living tree on Earth. And it is just under 5,000 years old. Oh my God, isn't that great? It's so crazy. It is a very slow growing species, and the exact location is not divulged. I believe it's on a national park, so they don't tell people exactly where it is for fear of vandalism, but it is still alive. And isn't that wonderful? The next is a tree that I've actually seen in person, and I saw this summer in Louisiana, and I felt it was a very special moment because look at it, look at that tree. Isn't that amazing? The root system down there, and if you can see my cursor where I'm pointing to, the roots that are exposed are as tall as I am. And it is a live oak. There are many live oaks in Louisiana. It is a staple of the Southern plantation era. A lot of them were planted when plantations were being established. And they're a signature tree there, and they usually have Spanish moss growing on them. They are also slow growing. And this one is right next to a famous bayou called Bayou Teche. And although I don't know the exact age of it, based on its size compared to other trees that I did see, I would guess it's around 200 and 250 years old. And I just gave it a name because I felt it deserved one, and I call it the Magdalena tree because there's a little Virgin Mary out underneath the root system there. And the friend who was showing it to me said that marriages have taken place in front of it, family gatherings, a lot of celebrations. So isn't that cool? Last is a little bit closer to home. And this is, I got curious when I was building this PowerPoint for Methuselah and the Magdalena tree. And I thought, oh God, what is the oldest saguaro that we know of? And that is a saguaro called Old Granddaddy, also very slow growing species. And it was in Saguaro National Park. I believe in the west, we have a west side and an east side to Saguaro National Park. They both surround Tucson, Arizona. And they guessed at the aging of that. Aging's not quite as straightforward for succulents as it is for woody species, but they estimated that it was about 300 or a little over 300 years old. And it slowly died in the 1990s just from old age, from bacterial necrosis, so starting to rot. And it did eventually topple over. But before it did, it was 40 feet tall with 52 arms, and many, many people went out to see it. So with that in mind, I'm assuming, I think rightfully so, that a lot of you here are interested in the longevity of trees and the specialness of trees, of celebrating them and taking care of them, even if it's for a more economic reason or wanting to cool your house down. But they can provide so many benefits, and they can live a very long time. the whole point of showing you those was that trees, and I'm including saguaro in this presentation, and palms and yucca, because they usually don't, they kind of end up in the corner end of the Venn diagram. So I'm just going to include them anyways. We can forget that they will live as long as us and our children and grandchildren. And if we set them up for success, if we take care of them, then it can be a shared experience for generations. Isn't that wonderful? With that in mind, we got a couple topics for today. I'm going to start with understanding how growing in the desert can be different than growing in California or in Louisiana or on the East Coast, how particular desert advantages or adaptations have evolved over time through our native tree species, and how to adapt your practices for trees that you want to grow that aren't native. Then we'll go over assessing your landscape and your existing trees, if you want to plant new trees, and understanding if the placement of your existing trees is good or bad, or how to alter it to benefit your trees long term. From there, we'll go into irrigation, and then into pruning, and then just a little bit about pollination. So join me. The thing I want to loop back to with the 3 examples that I just showed you, when considering long-lived trees, you might notice a few things that were similar about all 3 of those examples. One of them is that all of those species are very slow growing. So some people want something that will grow very quickly and give them a more immediate return. Some people are willing to, they think certain species are worth the wait. But it's good to understand that faster growing species will tend to die faster. They go through their life cycle just at a faster rate. And then some slower growing species that I've seen time and again with clients that I work with sort of get pushed to the side because they're slow growing. They can end up giving you a lot of satisfaction down the line. So that's something to note. The other thing you might have noticed is that each of these 3 examples are very different. They look different, they behave differently, and that's because they live in different areas, and they are suited for those areas. A bristlecone pine is not going to do very well in the wetlands of Louisiana. Neither is the saguaro. Saguaro would probably rot in the first year. So things that are well suited to the environment that they are adapted for, they'll do better. You can grow non-natives, other species in our desert environment, but it can be a harsh environment for certain species, and you have to, it's better to understand what's lacking for them so that you can provide a buffer that will help them to survive and thrive. Yeah, that's all I wanted to go to there. So one of the main ways that people will look to determine if a plant will grow well in their area is through plant hardiness zone maps. And here we've got the entire US, and a lot of it is based on temperature. Many plants are evolved with particular temperature checks. So either they can only stand a limited amount of freezing temperatures, like saguaro. If you look out on a hillside, you might notice that there are only saguaro growing on the southern face of that hill, not on the northern face. That's because the north face has too many cold below freezing nights, and that kills off all the little baby saguaro. Same thing occurs for other plants that are either cold intolerant or drought intolerant. So this is a good way to figure out if the thing that you want to grow or the thing that you have in your backyard is suited for where you're at. Here's a little snapshot of Arizona. You can see how Phoenix and Tucson are already a little different. And Tucson's a bit higher in elevation than Phoenix. So even between these 2 cities, there's differences there. And then Flagstaff is a whole other ball game up there. The other thing to keep in mind is that we are experiencing warming temperatures throughout the year in all areas. And that is due to climate change, but there's also urban heat island effect, which is all of these hardscapes like concrete and asphalt in our environments. Up in Phoenix and here in Tucson, we're getting a lot more infill too. And that can just make it so that our nights don't cool off. For some desert adapted plants, that's okay. They prefer not to cool off, or they're more worried about frost intolerance versus drought tolerance. But for other plants, they may not be able to deal with the heat as well. So that's also something to consider. And I personally, when I work with clients now, I've been selecting for more drought hardy species, including species that thrive well, say in Yuma, Arizona, that sort of thing. And if you want a little catalog that will show you a lot of different xeric species that are drought adapted, and including natives and non-natives, you can go to the website here. And it has just a catalog of potential trees for you to select in your yard. Some people may not like Palo Verde or mesquite. There's a lot of pollen generated from them. They can grow very, very large very quickly. But there are lots of different shapes of trees. Desert willow, for instance, does not grow nearly as wide and bushy as mesquite or Palo Verde will. Provides beautiful blooms, but there are some that grow up tall. There's some that spread out. There's a lot out there. So take a look and maybe you'll get inspired. Okay, so we'll go into a few simple adaptations to drylands that plants have. And I would say, as you're listening to this, take from it what you will. If there are things you don't understand, don't worry about it. All of these points are applicable to how you understand plant growth and how you will interact with your plants. So hopefully I'll end each point with the more practical side. So you can just wait for that if you don't want to get too far into the science. So of course she starts out with photosynthesis. For those of you that don't know, plants, especially leafed plants, they have what are called stomata that you can think of basically as pores. And they exist in their leaves, as you can see here in this diagram on the right. Those pores are all across their leaves. And what they do is they open and close in order for the plant to take in CO2 from the atmosphere, which it needs to photosynthesize. But as those stomata, as those pores are open, if there is lower humidity outside of the body of the tree than there is inside, and here in the desert, that's almost always the case, then the tree will lose water because those pores are open, water molecules are escaping into the air. So when there's lower humidity, which is almost all the time here, except for the monsoon season, I would say, you may need to water more because that is how the plant, the tree will maintain a stable internal moisture level. So that's just something to know, and it's just a function of how trees work. There are actually three types of photosynthesis. Not going to go into them. One is a more generic type of photosynthesis, more common for a lot of tree species, and definitely more common in higher humidity areas. But there are two other types that exist. One is not really applicable to here, but it just, the trees and the plants are more efficient at turning carbon dioxide and sunlight into sugars, so they don't need to open their stomata as often, and that saves them some water. But the second point here is actually one that a lot of succulent and cacti have adapted, which is they open their stomata only at night. So they separate the time when they gather sunlight and the time when they gather CO2, so that when they open at night, temperatures are cooler, it's less likely for them to lose water. Way cool. So the only thing you need to take from that is that when there's higher humidity, in the few weeks where we have higher humidity, your plants will need a little less water. Okay. The next thing to know is that a lot of desert trees, even if you don't particularly like desert trees, or you think they're common, they're everywhere, why do I need one in my yard? They have adapted to fix nitrogen from the air in their leaves and in their pods. And as you can see here, you get a lot of pod and leaf litter from mesquite, from palo verde, from ironwood. All of that is fixed with a higher amount of nitrogen, which all plants need. All plants need nitrogen, but our soils are lacking in nitrogen. So they have evolved to fix more of it, drop it on the ground, which then mixes into the soil and provides that nitrogen for not only that tree, but shrubs or any other vegetation that's growing around. So I will almost always try to get at least one member of the bean pod family, which is mesquites, the palo verde, ironwood, and I believe even acacia is part of that, into a plant palette because of the benefit of having that nitrogen fixation. This is more towards succulents and cacti. They have evolved to have a spongy tissue, which means that they will absorb water very quickly. That's what they have adapted to do. They're used to our monsoon rains where there's a lot of water really quick, and then it's gone. So they learn how to suck it up like a sponge, but there's a point at which they should not take on anymore. And these things in particular, they don't need nearly as consistent a watering as we may think, or as we may be doing for our non-native plants that are used to a gentler weekly or monthly rain. If you're dealing with cacti and succulents, they can go a long time without watering because they've got it in their tissues. There's also a really cool adaptation. You may know about frost or cold dormancy. That's when plants will drop their leaves, trees will drop their leaves in the winter time. And they shut down a lot of their functioning. They'll stop taking up water. They will just survive off of the nutrients that they've gathered in the fall time. But the same thing happens during drought here. And one of the best examples of this, the easiest to see, is ocotillo. So here on the right, you see a really green, vibrant ocotillo, and then on the left, one with no leaves whatsoever. An ocotillo will sprout out new leaves a few days after a rain, and then they will lose them within, I believe, 2 to 3 weeks after that. So they're sort of like hyper drought dormant, and that's their survival mechanism. But you'll see that with a lot of native trees. They will drop their leaves, and it doesn't mean that they're dying. A good way to tell if a branch is just gone dormant or if it's dead is you just take the very tip of it and just tweak it a little in your fingers. If it snaps in half and it's dry, then it's dead. But usually there's a little bit of flexibility, pliability. It's really easy to tell with, say, desert willow, because they're very flexible. But a lot of trees do this, and it's okay. Okay. So now I'm going to go into placement considerations. And this is not only for if you're thinking about putting in a new tree, it's also if you are, if you've inherited a tree or you just want to make sure that you're doing the right thing for an existing tree on your property or your project site. So one of the most important things in my mind to consider is the sun exposure that that tree is getting and whether or not that matches what that tree needs. So here on the left, and a lot of the pictures that you'll see here are actually from where I'm living now. I am renting a place that is owned by somebody who owns a landscaping company. And although we may have some philosophical differences on our landscaping practices, he's done a great job with planting a lot of very interesting trees that I now get to play with. The first one here that you see is an Arizona walnut. So that tree is more adapted to a riparian area, and riparian means closer to a creek or a spring, closer to a higher water table, to more consistent running above ground water. So they're used to that. There are several planted in Aravaipa Canyon, just to the northeast of Tucson. And they actually do produce walnuts, but they also are not as well adapted for the harsh afternoon sun. The morning sun, midday sun, and afternoon sun are not created equal. So your morning sun is accompanied with much cooler temperatures from the night. You know, you've had some time to cool off, and that sun is a lot less harsh on plants than your midday or your afternoon sun, where everything's had time to heat up and the sun is just beating down on it. So this tree in particular, we're looking northeast at it right now. So we've got a wall to the east side, and then right in the corner here, we see the edge of that truck. There's a little studio. So this tree has really strong morning exposure to the sun, but the studio is blocking it from that western afternoon sun. And that is great. That is why this tree looks so good, I think. It also gets a bunch of water, which I'm talking to my landlord about. It's a lot of water. So it's thriving because he considered the sun exposure for that. For trees that you may be considering or ones that you're diagnosing on your property, get to know it, look it up, look about what type of sun that it needs, and if it needs partial sun, partial shade, you want to gravitate more towards giving it morning and midday sun as opposed to afternoon sun. Afternoon sun here in the desert is really for plants that are adapted here. So keep that in mind. The next and very important consideration that you can't change unless you're willing to destroy some buildings after you plant your trees is its mature size, and if there are obstructions that are going to obstruct that mature size. So this, you'll see the white Tacoma, that is Madeline's white Tacoma. This was another house that I lived in, and I noticed there were 2 junipers, and they were planted just a foot away from the roof. And I don't think the mature size of those junipers was ever considered, because there's basically a notch, a 90-degree or right angle notch that is cut into both of their canopies in order for them to rise up over the roof. Not ideal for the tree. Anytime that you do any pruning, especially bad pruning, it will alter the chemical signaling that the tree has. It regulates its own growth based on, you know, the size of its canopy versus the size of its root structure. I need to learn more about this, but it's, from what I've learned, if you cut a root, that will affect the growth of the canopy. If you cut the canopy, that's going to affect the growth of the root system. They try to maintain a balance. And I won't go any further than that because that's about all I can attest to. But anytime you have to do this very unusual pruning that's asymmetrical, that doesn't take into consideration the tree's needs, the full canopy, because that juniper is also still growing, it's really going to hinder its ability to have long life. Another thing to consider is, how are you going to be using your space? And that's not just considering, is the tree going to be in my way, but it's also, where do I want to enjoy shade? Especially here in the desert, like, where do you want to enjoy shade? And where does the tree want to enjoy sunlight? It's a really beautiful partnership that you can have here. But this photo here on the left is a little bit of a sad example that is at the place I'm living now. Here on the left, right near this white beam, we've got the largest Mexican bird of paradise I've ever seen. Usually they're shaped like shrubs, but this one has grown really well, probably from a lot of water, and it's basically in a tree form now. But right next to it is an Arizona cotton. And look at this thing, this poor thing. So we're looking now to the northwest of the property. You see the studio in the background, and this is just an outdoor porch. So they're both shaded from morning and midday sun, and all they get is the afternoon sun here from the west. And that's great for this locust, or excuse me, not the locust, this bird of paradise. It's really, it's growing towards the light, towards the afternoon sun. It can handle it. But then there's this cotton right next to it that, because of the canopy of the bird of paradise, has been forced to grow the opposite way, towards the morning sun, which is the only light it can find. And that goes back to how you're going to use the space, because right here, where my cursor is dragging, is the main pathway between the patio and the studio. So that cotton is now growing into the main pathway. And I've had to prune it back a little bit. And it has not only warped the tree, because you can also see it's quite asymmetrical now. It's all leaning to one side. It has no room for its canopy to grow out on the other side, but it's also leaning into exactly where human heads are going to be walking back and forth. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about where you want to place your tree. Where do you want shade, and where does your tree want sun? Lastly, if you have not picked up so far, consider the water needs of your trees. So this here is also on that same property, and we're looking west-southwest now, or no, east-southeast now, inside that patio space. And we've got what is a species of cottonwood here, and I haven't quite figured out what species it is. I don't think it's a native. It might be eastern cottonwood, but whatever it is, it's not from around here, and it takes a lot of water to keep that vibrant green canopy. It's also not really in the best location. It's got about 4 feet of space, and it has to grow up and over this roof and then up and over a wall in order to get the sunlight. But for the sake of water, it needs a lot, and it's also right next to 2 concrete foundations. I would highly suggest any water intensive plants that you want to plant, any trees that need a lot of water, don't plant them within 5 feet of a foundation, because that area is going to be waterlogged. It may create problems for you a few years down the line. As for planting itself, it's really good to do in person, and maybe Watershed will do a video on proper planting techniques, because there are different schools of philosophies on how to do this. This is what I'm going to tell you. So the first thing that I do is I plant the water. And by that, I mean, not where am I going to put irrigation tubing, but how am I going to harvest rainwater? How am I going to use what's already going to fall on the ground near this tree, concentrate it around where I'm planting that tree? That's what it means to plant the water. And that term was coined by a Tucson resident, Brad Lancaster, who literally wrote 2 books on rainwater harvesting. And if you don't know about him, I would strongly suggest checking them out. The books are, I'm forgetting the title of the books. It's written elsewhere in the PowerPoint. We'll see it soon. But here in this photo on the right, you see this yellow blooming tree. That's a Palo Brea, which is a relative of Palo Verde. And then there's this funky shaped little depression right here. That's called a basin. It's filled with mulch, with palm clippings and that sort of thing. And this area would get flooded by a driveway from a duplex complex, and it would just flood that area and sit there. So I thought, well, gosh, I'll plant a tree right there. And this basin in particular is meant to help improve the soil infiltration rate so that the water will infiltrate into the soil much faster. You do that by creating more volume, which is you dig out the area a little bit, and then you add organic material, which then soaks up a lot of water like a sponge. Then you also add your trees, your grasses, your perennials, and they will also take up a lot of that water and reduce your flooding issues. But so before I even planted this Palo Brea, I built this basin. That is planting the water. From there, this next point has a little asterisk next to it. you want to plant with the soil level of the plant that you are putting in the ground to be equal with the top of your hole. Sometimes people suggest planting a little proud of that. Some people suggest planting a little shy of that. Sometimes it depends on where you're sourcing your plants from. There are 3 major nurseries here in Tucson where I will source plants from, 2 that I prefer, 1 that I go to if I need to. And that third one is because there are some practices that they use that I don't appreciate, but also when those plants are planted in the ground, within the first rain event, they will shrink. The soil level will shrink to like 2/3 of what it was. So then the plant is in a depression. So with those plants, when I'm sourcing from there, I will plant them a little proud with that in mind. The other 2 I plant at soil level. So sometimes it takes knowing your nursery a little bit, asking them about their potting practices. But that's way into nerddom there. The next point is for trees in particular and single trunked shrubs. What's really important is ensuring that the first 2 to 3 inches of that main trunk are upright in all directions. And I use this photo as an example because I'd actually rescued this Palabrea from a client who didn't want it anymore. She was afraid it was going to die and she wanted it replaced. So I took it home and babied it. You'll see here that a majority of the branches are veering off in one direction. And the inclination that a lot of people have is to look up at the canopy and plant the canopy upright. Makes sense why people would think that, but trees will grow more branches. They won't grow another trunk unless they're multi-trunked, but we're going to ignore that for now. For these single trunk trees, the one thing that they can't change is that first 2 to 3 inches that are in the ground. So if that is upright, it will, get established once you plant it. And I wish I had another photo of this tree now, but its branches that are off to the left now are starting to grow larger because it can send signals to itself to balance out its canopy, start growing in the other direction. It can't upright its trunk. So focus on the 2 to 3 inches. The other thing you want to do is ensure that the root flare of your tree is exposed. And a good way to think of it, my friend came up with this term, is the trees have hips. They have a little bit of an opening down at the bottom. That is the root flare. You can even scratch the top of the soil. And once you start to see very fine roots, that is the top layer of roots for a tree. And it's very important that not get buried because a lot of oxygen exchange actually happens at that level. Sometimes nurseries will bury their own trees. That has happened at this third nursery that I don't like to use. And when I'm planting trees, I will always check, is the trunk just straight up and down or are there hips coming out? And if it's just straight up and down, then I dig down until I find the hips and then I level the soil accordingly. From there, once you got your 2 to 3 inches upright, your root flare exposed, think about the branches that you're seeing and where they're oriented. In this photo here on the right, I wanted the branches to be oriented out away from the fence. And there are also some, it's hard to see, but there's some sort of coming out towards the camera. And with that in mind, I knew that this tree would have to grow up and over this fence, this chain link fence here. My hope was that I could time it accordingly so that the canopy would grow up and over it. The branches that you're seeing on a 5-gallon tree or a 15-gallon tree, if you're getting a new tree from a nursery, those are going to be the main branches of that tree 20 years down the line. So the way that they're pointed, if there's one that's pointed right over a pathway, you're going to have to prune that at some point. And I would rather plant a tree with as little pruning down the line as necessary, because pruning is a traumatic experience for the tree. Last thing is to remove any tags or stakes that come with the tree. Some people will leave them, but if a tree is tied to a stake, it's going to prevent it from having to experience some wind and some variability, some pushback that will force it to, it will signal to grow more stabilizing roots. So if the stake is removed early on, then I think we'll have a stronger root system over time. And anything that's wrapped around the tree, you also want to remove, like the price tag, something like that, because that will prevent the tree from being able to grow in diameter as well. Okay, next up is irrigation. And I'm going to start out with what you might not think is irrigation and tell you that it really is. And that is rainwater harvesting. Oh my goodness. We all, hopefully everyone here has a roof that they live under. And that roof is going to collect rainwater. And that is a wonderful source of water for trees and shrubs. It is actually a higher quality water until it hits the roof than a lot of municipal sources because it's higher in nitrogen than our municipal water supplies. There are ways to filter it out if you need to, but to filter out like the debris, the sand, the sediment, the bird poop that might be on your roof. But for the most part, you don't need to do that if it's just going straight to the landscape. And what Watershed does is we will design for what are called berms and basins. So in this diagram here on the top right, you see these light blue funky shapes. Those are basins. Those are depressions in the soil that will hold water up to a certain point, and then once they fill up, they'll overflow to the next basin. It's basically like making a giant waffle with your front yard or your backyard. The little divots, you know, where you put the butter in and it melts and it's a delicious piece of buttery, syrupy waffle. It's like that for the tree, but with rainwater. And this, the design here on the right is the actual design for this landscape that I installed. And the basins are shaped a little differently in the actual implementation. That happens. But you'll notice where my cursor is circling right now, it's a little hard to see, but there's this little green cap right there. And that is connected to a pipe that is connected to a gutter downspout for this entirety of the north section of this roof. So when it rains, all of that water is going to go under the sidewalk here and then pop up from that pop-up, that's what it's called, into this basin and fill the basin. You'll notice again, there's a grass in the basin, there's mulch. So those are things that help to ensure the water is going to infiltrate, not become a mosquito issue, and it's going to go towards this prized mulberry tree that this client loved and couldn't bear to get rid of. And you can see that there are basins all around the tree here. So that is a form of supplemental irrigation. And you'll also notice that the basins are around the canopy of the tree, or the canopy edge of the tree. That is where you want to be watering. That is where the active roots of that tree are. And by active roots, I mean the roots that are taking up that water. You don't want to focus it near the trunk of the tree. That can cause root rot. So you want to focus it around the edge of the tree there. So that is actually a form of irrigation that you can do for an existing tree that will, hands down, help it succeed. It provides a deep watering, much more so than your standard irrigation tubing will. Here's another example, and this is here at our Living Lab and Learning Center, otherwise known as our office. And here in the bottom right, you have another diagram. It's hand-drawn, but it shows that there's some rocked terrace, and then this entire other area in the diagram where my cursor is going over, and pointing to it here now in the actual photo. That whole area is a basin. So we do things, we experiment a lot here. But this is an entire basin. Again, it has the pop-up mechanism where roof water will go first into a tank and then into the landscape. And this is also good for establishing new plants. Here you see on the left a little peach, and here on the right is a fig. And The next picture I'm going to show you was taken a couple months ago. These were installed, I believe, 2 or 3 years ago now, just before I showed up. And this is without any municipal irrigation. Ta-da! So the peach, it's taking its time, it needs a lot more water. But the fig, oh my goodness, the fig is so big now, and it's producing fruit for us. And that is all with rainwater. So keep that in mind. This is another example of irrigating, and this time it's with street water. Some people are willing to do that, some are not, but it's a valuable resource. It's a deep watering for your trees, for your shrubs. And I need to go back to this site and see how these are doing. I think she sent me pictures, and everything's growing like at least 3 feet tall now. But this is all water collected off the street. It helps prevent stormwater flooding down the line. And then these grasses in here will start biofiltration to filter out chemicals. Another form of irrigation that you can consider, especially for fruit producing trees, is gray water. So that's your laundry water, that's sink water, shower and bathtub. And those are consistent sources of water that you already use and you could use again, especially on fruit producing trees, which need a much more consistent long-term irrigation supply. And here again, this is at our living lab. We've got this purple tube here that is pipe from our bathroom sink. And then here is another form of irrigation tubing that's coming from our laundry system. And it supplies water for our grapefruit tree. So those are a little outside the box irrigation methods. Then there's what I'll call active irrigation, where you are a much more active player in it. And there are 2 types of irrigation there still. There is the more traditional pressured system where you're using municipal water that is at a much higher PSI, anywhere from 40 to 70 PSI. There's usually a timer, or there's tubing, or you can just use a hose. And there's a much smaller diameter of tubing, and that is to maintain pressure over time. This is great for, at least for the timer and emitter style, that's great for consistent watering, but it tends not to be very deep. And your trees over time will need a deep watering, and they don't need it as often. So a lot of people will do that with a hose. They will just put the hose on for an hour or 2. That's good. But you could, again, be doing that with rainwater. The other style of active irrigation that you can do is with a rain tank. It is possible. We have classes on gravity-based irrigation systems. So if you're looking to save water, that is one way to do it. Again, and it can be set up the same way with a timer and tubing, but we tend to use larger diameter tubing and distribution parts in order to maintain flow, since there is no pressure. The other thing to know is, what is the root structure of the tree in question, or the tree that you're wanting to support? Here are some common desert plants, and it's just meant to show you how different their root structures are. So mesquite are famous or infamous for their taproot that is meant to find the water table and get a majority of its water there. Then you have a saguaro, which has very wide spreading but shallow roots. Again, that is to take up as much water as possible from a large rain event. And saguaro roots will be twice as long as it is tall. Wow. Oh my goodness. The other thing to know about when you're watering, not only how deep you need to water, because again, the tips of these roots are what's active. That's what you want to get to. You also want to know how wide you should be watering, and that's around the canopy edge. That's also called the drip edge, but that is where those roots are going to be active. They're going to be taking up the most water. That's where you're being most efficient with your watering. You don't want to water around the trunk. And the last thing to know, in general, unless you're in an extreme case, you don't necessarily have to worry about this too much, but if you have very, very sandy soil, or if you have very, very clayey soil, it can impede your watering technique. So if you have very sandy soil, you might be able to get away with tubing and emitter style irrigation because it infiltrates so deep. But if you have clayey soil, and I had clay at the location where that Palo Brea photo was taken, it will just stay on top of the soil surface and it won't infiltrate down. So you really have to use more water for deep watering. So it's good to know at least the basics of your soil type. The other thing to note for irrigation is that you may not need to irrigate year-round. Even if you don't actively use rainwater harvesting, if you don't have any basins on your property, there are times when your plant is not going to need as much water. So you may be able to shut off the irrigation system or just do a couple sparse hand waterings. Here we've got a graph, and the blue line is rainfall, and this is specific to Tucson, Arizona. So it may be a little bit different for Glendale, but we've got a little bit of a bump here from December to February. Those are our gentle winter rains, and they last a bit longer, but they're not as intense. Then we go down next to nothing, April through June, and we get a huge spike. That's the monsoon. But you'll also notice there's a red line, and that is plant demand. And it changes over time based on the humidity, based on the soil moisture level, and based on temperature. So there's not a lot going on in the winter time when we have those winter rains. And that's because a lot of things are either dormant, it's cool enough that they're not losing a lot of water, they can be more efficient with the water that they've got in their bodies. But then it goes way high in the driest part, the driest, hottest part of the year, which makes sense because it's dry and hot. They're losing the water that's in their bodies a lot more quickly. They can't be as efficient with it, so they need more water then. But then in July, August, September, it goes back to being less than the amount of rainfall that's happening in a regular year. I don't know about Glendale, but Tucson only got one rain event this entire monsoon. So sad. So you'll notice here that rainfall for most of the year is generally higher than the plant demand. It's really only in April to June that plant demand is a lot higher. Now this is just for the plants here at our living lab. It could be different if, say, you have a grove of citrus. They're gonna probably have a much higher plant demand the entire year round. But it gives you an idea of seasonality so that instead of investing a whole bunch of time and effort into irrigation tubing, into maintenance costs and that sort of thing, you may only have to plan for a little chunk of the year where you provide supplemental irrigation. I'm not going to go into too much detail here. This is a little bit of math, but this is from that book I mentioned earlier, Rainwater Harvesting for Drylands and Beyond by Brad Lancaster. It's one of his appendices. And it goes through how to calculate the average demand either in a year or in a particular month for a variety of common native and non-native species. So here's an example of desert ironwood, and I'm not going to go into it. For those of you that are curious, Appendix 4 is available on Brad's website for free. You can download it. And there's an index with multiple different trees on there. And it just tells you how to calculate the general water needs of that plant. So in much more detail than I just did. But for instance here, I'm going to throw out a couple general numbers. So for desert ironwood, for mesquite, for palo verde, a mature tree in that class is going to use about 3,000 gallons per year in water. It's not all at the same time either. About half of it is going to be in that April, May, June period. The other half is spread out throughout the rest of the year. For something like grapefruit, which is non-native, food producing, very high water use plant, it's going to use something like 9,000 gallons per year, 3 times that amount. And again, a third of that, almost a half of that, is in April, May, June. For deciduous food-producing plants like pomegranate and fig, they use somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 gallons per year. And for other trees, it's different, but that gives you a general idea of the spectrum of water demands for trees. Yeah, I think I'll leave that at that. Okay, now we're gonna go into pruning. And I'm bringing Methuselah back up just to note that this tree, even though I have no way to vouch for the other 4,800 years, probably has never been pruned. Pruning is unnecessary in areas of very low disturbance, like an area that's been protected. And it's really only necessary in urban environments where we have a lot of different obstructions or buildings, overhead lines, sidewalks, and that sort of thing. And I find that people rely too much on pruning as a remedy for bad plant placement. So instead, if you're going to plant a new tree, try to plant for the mature size, because the more you prune, the harder it's going to be for that tree to live a good life. And the two things that I really, really hope you never do, never, ever, ever do, are line tailing and topping. Those are shown here in these two images. The top left is lion tailing, where it looks like a little lion's tail. And the bottom right is topping, where you cut off the top of basically every branch on the tree. These harm trees. These make it hard for them to live. They can cut years off of their lives. And actually, I'm going through arborist certification training right now. And the International Society of Arborists will take away your license if they find out that you've been topping trees. It's that bad. Lion tailing in particular is, well, both of them are bad because they're very extreme pruning measures where you're altering basically the whole canopy. And you want to prune back or alter no more than 1/3 of the canopy in one session. And even then, that's pretty extreme. I almost never do more than 10% of a canopy. But lion tailing takes away a majority of the canopy of the tree, except for these wisps at the top. And what is the canopy of the tree? It's its means of producing its own food. So if you take away the ability for that tree to produce its own food, you're effectively forcing it into this survival mode that it may not make it out of. You're also reducing its ability to shade itself, which is very important here in the desert. You'll notice that mesquite and Palo Verde, they have these very broad, very full looking canopies. But if you take a closer look, the branches aren't that concentrated. There's never going to be just like 10 branches on Palo Verde. There's going to be, somewhere between like 70 to 100 smaller size branches diameters. And when you cut back to just, one arm instead of the 4 or 5 different arms coming off of a branch, you're forcing it to concentrate a lot of weight on a single branch, which then could potentially make it more prone to break off. You're also exposing, especially for Palo Verde, them to sunlight, and they can get sunburned. I've actually seen it on that Palo Brea that I had back in the beginning when it didn't have a lot of canopy. It was starting to get sunburned. Just sad to see. Topping, a lot of the same issues there too, but in terms of reducing the canopy size, making it so the tree can't feed or shade itself. But when you cut off the top of a branch, and these are all what's called stub cuts, but you can see how they just don't let the branch complete all the way to the end. When you do that, that alters the plant's growth chemicals. It signals to itself. It doesn't know which branch is now the main branch, where it should put its energy and resources into, and which branch it might abort or let die, so that it can survive. It turns it into a shrub, which is not how it wants to grow. So these things, please never do. And if you see your neighbors doing it, just implore them not to do it anymore. Next is crown thinning, which I wrote in yellow instead of red because there are instances where I think it can be appropriate. And you'll notice here on the diagram, it's really just selecting out certain branches. But again, that goes back to the forcing a tree to concentrate all of its resources on one branch instead of, say, 3 or 4, which, particularly for desert trees, is not how they're meant to grow. They like to have a lot of medium to small sized branches. So it really depends on your situation for crown thinning, but it can be possible. There's also crown raising, which may have to happen a lot in an urban environment, especially for signage. So here is an ironwood at our living lab that I had to cut to 8 feet tall in the public right-of-way. And I tried to balance it out across the entire canopy, raising it up like that. And although it's not ideal for the tree because you're then creating an opportunity for it to get sunburned down at the bottom, it's kind of just a fact of life for urban tree life. Excuse me. The next practice, crown cleaning, is one that I do all the time, and is the only one that I think actively benefits the tree. And crown cleaning is when you are removing crossing limbs, diseased or dead limbs, broken limbs, or stub cuts. And this example here on the right is a Palo Verde, another house I used to live at. My landlords, they all love me. But I did some major pruning on this tree, and I found several instances of crossing limbs that had been allowed to grow into each other. And when they do that, there's going to be wind through the canopy, and they start rubbing up against each other. And what does that rubbing do? Well, you'll see here on the bottom limb that I left, it creates basically an open wound on the tree that's continually open. And tree bark is, you can think of it similar to a human body. The bark is the skin. It protects it from, microbial threats like bacteria, viruses, even insects, because there's a lot of insects that will take advantage of a tree that's diseased or that has an open wound like this one. And then underneath the skin is the veins, if you want to call them that, the xylem and phloem, which transfer sugars from the canopy down through the tree, and then water up from the roots to the rest of the tree. So when you've got this open wound continually festering, it really impedes the tree's ability to help itself. Luckily, this was only on one branch, but it's something that you want to get rid of. And I actually, for those of you that are curious why I took the top one off and not the bottom, the top one was also crossing another branch at another area. I took it off there. Here is another clear example of stub cuts. This is a tree that I've done a lot of remedial pruning on. There was an unfortunate miscommunication, and a group of landscapers came in and basically took chainsaws to everything on the site, and it broke my heart. But what I'll do is cut back all these stubs. You can also see that they cut in such a way that it tore a lot of the bark back on what was remaining. Again, that's an open wound. That's just going to make it harder for the tree to thrive. So here is proper pruning principles. Say that 5 times fast. And let's start here on the bottom right with the 3-cut method. And this is a method that you only use with a pruning saw, which is this, this device here on the bottom left. And with that, it helps to prevent a lot of this tearing that you see here on this mesquite. The way that it works, is that you will cut a small incision on the bottom of the limb that you're taking off, just an inch, maybe 2 inches in, depending on the diameter of the branch. You really just want to get past, well past the bark tissue. Then from there, you start from the top and cut your way down, further out onto the limb than that initial cut. And what that does is it allows a majority of the weight of the limb to fall off. And it will often tear the bark back to this first incision, but it will stop there and it won't go to the remaining part of the tree that you're trying to keep. And then from there, with a majority of the weight off, you can make your final cut, which is much more precise and you know it's not going to tear. So that's the 3-cut method. Anytime I'm using a saw, I use that method. And sometimes it requires you to move your ladder around, if you're using a ladder, multiple times in order to get the right angle. But it's well worth it, and it ensures some long-term vitality for your tree. Up here on the left, these proper pruning principles, that is more for if you're cutting with hand pruners. Ooh, excuse me. There we go. Hand pruners, these on the top, or loppers, which are on the right here. And you just want to make sure that you're cutting, oh, and as Joanne mentioned, both of these are bypass. So bypass means that one blade will pass by the other, which makes sense. There's another type of loppers in particular. I don't know if I've ever seen hand pruners with this, that's anvil, where you basically take blade onto a bit of harder metal and you'd like smash the limb apart. That's terrible for it. Creates a lot of tearing. You don't want to do that. Bypass is much more surgical, much more precise, and leaves your tree with the cleanest wound possible so that it can heal over it. But back to this diagram up here. Sorry, trying to find my cursor. Cursor! Can't find it. All right, gonna go without the cursor. So in this diagram here, it shows you multiple things. The main thing you need to worry about is what is called the branch collar. And that's this little mound that's below where the limb that you're cutting off attaches to the main trunk or the larger limb that it's growing out from. And you want to cut just beyond that, just barely beyond it, like within 1/4 of an inch. And that is the area where the remaining bark tissue on that remaining limb or trunk can begin to grow over the wound and eventually cover it. But if you cut beyond that, like several inches beyond that, then you're going to be left with what's called a stub cut, and that will die off. And then any dead wood that is still attached to living wood can become an entry point for opportunistic insects or disease vectors, that sort of thing. So those are your basic pruning methods. And then putting this in there again, I try not to take anything off-site when I'm doing pruning. Sometimes I have to if I'm pruning really, really large limbs, but when possible, I will just do what's called chop and drop into existing rain basins. So then I'm replenishing all of the nutrients, all of the resources that are in those branches, in those limbs, back to where the tree can use them again. Many of you may have or may be curious about palm pruning. There are some very simple things to know about that. You will see oftentimes people pruning palms so that it's just a few very immature fronds at the very top. Sort of like if you took all of your hair into a ponytail in the top of your head. That is also not beneficial for the palm. That is not a good practice. Instead, you want, where you can see this yellow line across the diagram with the palm, you want the lowest fronds to basically be horizontal like that. You don't want to cut up from that. Again, that is to protect the palm, it's just similar to the idea with the tree canopies. They have them for a reason, and you can take out dead fronds. They can host beehives and scorpions. They can also be a liability when they shed them. But you want to keep as much of the healthy fronds as you can. Okay, couple notes on pollination, and then we'll be ready for Q&A. I hope, oh yay, we're right on time. Okay, so pollinators, oh my goodness, I love them. Look at that cute picture of a little bee butt in that white flower. That's little leaf cordia. It is just the cutest picture I've ever taken. But there's more to pollination than just bees and butterflies and hummingbirds. Those are the charismatic species that we think of with pollination. But there are also a lot of pollinators that you might not have thought of. There's moths, there's bats, there's even mice and lizards. So just consider that even if the point of you having a tree on the property is not for it to propagate over time, consider that there's a larger system at play. It is supporting probably multiple different species through pollination. And yeah, share with the neighbors, the furry and the winged. There is a tree trail where you can tour a lot of different tree species in Glendale. I do not know these streets. All I'm gonna say is that it's Brown Street and 59th Avenue, which is somewhere in Glendale. Joanne can help out if there are questions about that. Yeah, that's all I've got. Let's do Q&A.
All right. So yes, so for folks, the Glendale Xeriscape Demonstration Garden, that is located around the Glendale Main Library. And you're exactly right, Madeline. The cross streets are 59th Avenue and Brown. So Brown, there is a traffic light. It is just south of Peoria Avenue. For those of you that think maybe more like as far as landmarks, the Glendale Xeriscape Demonstration Garden is just north of Glendale Community College. So if you kind of know where the community college is, we're just north. And this is a demonstration garden. So for those of you that are thinking about a tree, chances are we probably have that tree at the Xeriscape Garden. We probably even have a tree sign that identifies that tree. I always tell people, you know, come to the garden because you're going to see the tree in its mature natural form. We're not hyper pruning. You'll see how tall that tree gets, how wide that tree gets, and then you'll be able to determine whether or not it'll fit in your particular landscape. So I hope that helps answer the question about that. So Madeline, great. We've been getting a lot of questions throughout the class, a lot of enthusiasm. So that's awesome to see. I think we were able to help people out with the AMWA landscape plants for the Arizona Desert publication. So that lists 40 desert adapted trees that will survive and thrive in the desert. Not all of those species are indigenous or native to the Sonoran Desert, but they will still do quite well. So for example, acacias aren't native to the Sonoran Desert, but they love it here. They'll be fine. You'll do fine with them. I have a question for you, Madeline. I don't have experience growing figs. So someone's got a fig and their question was, I have a fig tree that I grew from a small sapling. It's now about 3 feet tall and is doing well. I thought that fig trees could stand the direct sun, but in direct sunlight, it would lose its leaves. This person wrote, I put it in the shade and after a while it recovered, but it is still periodically losing its leaves and the cycle repeats. Do you think this is a watering problem or something else?
So I know that figs, they have several diseases that I've come into contact with. And what would really help is taking a picture of the leaves as the fig is dropping them, because it can tell you if it's drought related or if it's disease related. If it's just yellowing and getting brown and black and dropping off, yeah, that is probably, it needs more water. But otherwise, there are a lot of resources online for figs, and I'm still learning too. But the property that I'm at now has 3 mature figs They go through this cycle, but all of them receive direct sunlight, and they will just occasionally drop, 20, 30 leaves at a time. And as far as I can tell, it's just the plant signaling to itself like, I'm not going to worry about that limb right now. I'm going to focus on this one. But if it's the entire plant losing its leaves, you may want to consider slowly, what's the word I'm looking for? Acclimatizing it to sunlight, like put it out in direct sun, but with a shade cloth over it for a while, see how it does there. Maybe have 2 different styles of shade cloth, or fold it once over itself first so that it provides more shade, and then open it up completely so that it's getting dappled sunlight. It may need that in order to get used to the sunlight. And at the same time, for fig in particular, I always try to encourage people to think about their gray water sources, because it does need a lot of water, but they're such a delicious fruit that you want to support them. So, yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you. You want to have the landscape that, if you're going to be eating from your landscape, I say go for it. You know what, regardless of its water use. So, but you bring up a good point, Madeline, that there's a lot of information online, and I always recommend to people go to the experts. So the University of Arizona Cooperative Extension, they have so many wonderful publications on horticulture for our climate. So if you just Google University of Arizona Cooperative Extension publications, there are resources on figs. So I was able to send that one person a URL to an article on figs. And the reason that I always tell people to go to Extension is because it's research-based. It's not someone's opinion. It is based on science. There are scientists that are studying all different aspects of plants. And that's why I really like that you were talking about the stomata at the beginning, because plants are these living organisms, right? And so there are scientists that study these things. How cool is that? And they are going to provide information that is specific to our region. So they're not giving us, horticulture practices for Chicago, Illinois, which is where I'm from. They're giving us horticulture resources for the low desert. All right. So, Madeline, I don't have a lot of experience with gray water harvesting. One person was asking, should they be concerned about high alkalinity in their gray water with their plants? So the question was, should I be concerned about the pH level of the gray water I put on my trees?
That's a great question. So I would say yes, alkalinity, the saltiness of your soil is something to consider. And usually when I install or design for a gray water system, I also pair it with a rainwater basin so that when it does rain, it will flush all of those salts further below the root zone of whatever trees it's supporting. But there are also soaps and detergents out there that don't contain any sodium in them. And they are made, some of them are made specifically for this type of application. Some of them just happen to not have any sodium in them. So the thing that I recommend to people is just look at the ingredients list on your soap container or your detergent. And if there's any string of words that contains sodium in it, over time that can build up in the soil and slow down the growth of your plant. And for some very delicate plants, it could kill them. But most plants can stand it. We get a lot of anecdotes of people using Dr. Bronner's, which contains, I think, sodium lauryl sulfate in it. And they say, oh yeah, my plant's been fine for 4 years. Like I use it all the time. So I really think that if you do use gray water, just make sure that you have a plan for flushing it at least twice a year with either municipal water or with rainwater.
Okay, and then Madeline, in that same vein, someone was asking, how do you harvest gray water? Before you answer that, I will say that Arizona Department of Environmental Quality, they have a really handy publication, which I think I have somewhere in the chat. And it's literally like a 3-sided brochure back and forth that goes over the best practices for gray water. So check that out. But Madeline, do you harvest gray water? You're the expert. What do you do?
Oh my gosh, yes, I love gray water. I convinced my landlord, well, convinced is a strong word. I showed him what I do for a living and he's like, yeah, go for it with the laundry. But one of the easiest ways to harvest gray water is with your laundry machine. It will pump out a lot of water in a short amount of time. So it's really good for that deep watering. If you want to pair it with, say, like an emitter system that only provides, the consistent short watering or shallow watering. But the other great thing about laundries, as opposed to sinks or showers, is that it doesn't have to be gravity based. You don't have to worry about slope of pipe or anything like that. And Watershed does have, actually, is that okay? I think it's next week. I am doing a how to install your own laundry to landscape system class. It's virtual, so for those of you that are interested in it, it's literally videos of me installing a system, but it relies on the pump of the washer to push it out initially, and then you can supply water, I would say, for depending on your situation. If it's just you living alone, it might be different than like a family of 5, but you can supply several fruit trees just from your laundry water if you're there consistently.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, I haven't done that. I harvest rainwater, but I've never done the gray water. So, and I think part of it is just because my plumbing is all inside and there's not like a stub out to the exterior of our house. So, yeah, I'm kind of embarrassed to say I haven't done gray water yet, and my job is water conservation, but I'll get there. I'll get there. So we've been having some questions about, sealants on the, on a wound on a tree. I've always been told no, because if you properly prune the tree, it will compartmentalize like you described. And I always tell people, like, you can tell when it's compartmentalized because it looks like a donut. And I think of that guy that said, time to make the donuts, because I have a simple mind. So I'm always thinking about food. So no sealants, but someone was asking about, why do you sometimes see the white paint on citrus?
The white what on citrus?
White paint on the citrus trees?
Yeah. Okay, so I'll start with the sealants. I completely agree. I never use them. Trees and woody plants in general, they have this adaptation, and it's got an acronym, compartmentalize and something. Hopefully the acronym isn't COVID. That would be ironic. But they will shut down particular cells and just keep resources from going to them. And if you cut where we were showing with the 3-cut method, or right above the branch collar, then it can effectively create its own bandage and treat that wound as part of its exterior skin again. So you really shouldn't need a bandage. It's, as far as I can tell, really just a means of selling another product that you don't need if you prune correctly. The white paint on citrus is sunscreen, and it is totally unnecessary if you allow the citrus to have an actual canopy and shade itself. Then you won't need that paint. But citrus, especially for younger citrus that are not used to the sunburn that they can experience here, people will paint white paint on them. I do not know, but I'm going to suspect that if that paint is all over the root flare, it can impede some of that oxygen transfer that happens in that area. But I would never paint a citrus. I would find either a way to shade it naturally with another tree, like place it to the northeast of a shade tree so that it's blocked from that harsh western afternoon sun, or just a shade cloth.
Yeah, that's good feedback. Yeah, and I think a lot of times you'll see trees that have been sunburned because of hyper pruning. So let them, leave the leaves be, right? I mean, that's how they make food for themselves. So if you can allow them to do what they do well, which is grow leaves for food, and then it protects them from any sunburn. Let's see. I'm so excited about all the questions that we have. This is a very engaged audience. I love doing this. This is I just love answering questions. And if I don't know, I just ask you, Madeline. Okay, so one person was asking about the big three, the big three nitrogen fixers. You know, of the three, which is the best? So the mesquite, the ironwood, and the palo verde. My response was that they're all three native to the Sonoran Desert. They're all nitrogen fixing. They all have special adaptations, right? They have the small leaves, they lose less water. I don't like pruning plants with thorns, so I personally have a thornless Palo Verde in my front yard. It's a hybrid, but do you have a favorite? Is there one that does better in the desert?
I laugh whenever I hear a question about like what's best, because in my old age, I've realized that there's no best, there's just context. So they grow differently. So there are some varieties that are thornless and they have different shapes. And there's also different species of each one of those. There's velvet mesquite and scrubine mesquite and honey mesquite. That's a Texas native, but I would plant it here. There's foothills Palo Verde and blue Palo Verde and then Palo Brea. And then there is, well, I guess there's only one ironwood, but ironwood is more slow growing. So it's more, you know, if you're in it for the long haul, you can go with an ironwood. If you want something that's a little faster growing, you might do a blue Palo Verde or a velvet mesquite. If you want a very large canopy, then you might do a honey mesquite. There was one at an old house that was, oh God, I loved that tree so much. It covered a 40 by 20 foot patio outside and it made it just lovely. Scrubine mesquite, if you don't know what that is, look it up. The scrubines are so cute. So it's more like, what do you want the tree to do? What space is it going to be in? Think about that. If you're thinking about hardiness, and that's what you meant by best, then it really just depends on where you're putting the tree and which one would be most suited to that. They're all very low water use. Ironwood likes more like rocky hillsides, that sort of thing. So does Palo Verde. Mesquite tends to be slightly more riparian, wanting, you know, a little bit more water, or thriving with a little bit more water. So right plant, right place. And what's your place like?
Sure. Yeah, that's a tough one to answer because, you know, they're all so different. And, you know, I always tell people, like, when you go out hiking in the desert, right? So I live, you know, I'm in the Phoenix metro area, you're in the Tucson area. But if you go Phoenix, we have so many hiking trails. And when you're out hiking, you see those three species, the mesquite, the Palo Verde, and the ironwood, and they look like giant shrubs. And then I compare and contrast with the trees, those three species that are then at the, you know, grocery store parking lot that were like toothpicked, right? And they just don't do well because they want to take on that shrubby, robust appearance. They don't want to be that single stem tree. So it kind of depends, like you said, the right plant in the right place. So that's so good to hear. They're all great trees. And that's kind of why earlier too, I was also mentioning that, you know, you don't have to be a Sonoran Desert purist. So like there's other tree species that do quite well here. And I think that's okay. I think it's okay that we have trees from other desert adapted climates here. Yeah. Okay, we've got just a few more questions. So it's almost 7 o'clock. I want to be respectful of people's time. Someone wrote, I have an orange tree that used to have sweet fruit, but for the past 4 years, the fruit is always sour. Do you think this is a problem of lack of nutrients or the sour orange root that it was grafted onto took over the tree? I don't know.
I would have to look at the tree, I think. But also, citrus in particular, this is not uncommon, this question. And I feel like they kind of have a shelf life, so to speak. It may be nutrients. You can try a citrus fertilizer on it that's particularly for that. But yes, it could also be that the graft is taken over, or the root graft has taken over. It could also be that it's an old orange. Do you know how old it is? And are there other things that have changed? Is it getting more shade now, so it can't produce as many sugars? And I mean like energy sugars, not sweet sugars. That sort of thing. There's so much that we don't know about trees, and I feel like we're still kind of these infants, newborns. We're figuring it out, tinkering, all these hundreds of years. But when it comes down to it, I will do a little, just like a tiny experiment, like maybe put a little bit of fertilizer on it, give it a couple months, see what happens. Take away or bring in some shade, see what happens. And I know it sounds kind of either like a cop-out or a little woo-woo, but I let the tree tell me what's going on. Because it knows what's going on way better than I do.
That's good information. Yeah, and some of these things, you know, it's just hard to tell without seeing it. And I want everyone to know that it almost looks like I'm working for the University of Arizona Cooperative Extension. I'm not, you know, but I love them. So, you know, each of the counties also has what are called master gardeners. And so these are people that have gone through horticulture training. They have continuous education that they have to do every year. And they also have to do volunteer hours to retain that certification. So Maricopa County Cooperative Extension has a hotline. They have an email. So if you have a specific plant question, you can email them, you can call them. And for those of you, I don't have that information right with me right now, but you can email me and I will send you the Cooperative Extension's information. And the volunteers, like, they don't just do like a knee-jerk reaction as far as responding to your question. I mean, they do extensive research. They sometimes will vet it past other master gardeners. So I highly recommend contacting them for specific, you know, unique questions about your plants, because we know that plants are an investment, right? And we want you to protect your plant investment. So just for the sake of time, because it is past 7, if anybody had any questions that we didn't answer, feel free to email me. I will do my best to respond. My email is jtoms, T-O-M-S, at glendaleaz.com. Call me, 623-930-3596. We will answer those questions. And Madeline, thank you so much for your time. I can tell that you're very passionate about trees, and that's awesome. We need more tree advocates out there. We live in the desert. In the Phoenix Metro, we had 146 days where it was 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Trees provide so many benefits. Let's give back to them.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah, when I grow up, I want to be a tree. So thank you for hosting me. And I hope that, you know, everybody here got at least a little nugget for how to move forward with planting a tree, taking care of a tree, that sort of thing.